Welcome to Brainish English Stories.
Restless people live in a big part of the town. They don't have a permanent home, but they have many places they stay in. They move from one room to another, never staying in one place for long. They like to sing songs and carry their things in small boxes. They don't have real gardens, but they keep plants in pots. In this neighborhood, many different people have lived in the same houses. They should have many stories to tell, although most of them might be boring. But there might be a few spooky stories too. One night, a young man walked around the old red houses, ringing their doorbells. At the 12th house, he put down his small bag and wiped his face. The bell sounded faint and far away. A woman who looked tired and unfriendly answered the door. She seemed like a worm that had eaten everything and now wanted to fill its empty space with new tenants. The young man asked if there was an available room. "Come inside," said the woman. Her voice was weird, and her throat seemed soft like velvet. "I have a room on the 3rd floor that's been empty for a week. Do you want to see it?" The young man followed her up the stairs. The hallways were dark, with a little bit of dim light. They walked on a carpet that seemed like it came from a plant and was sticky underfoot. There were empty spaces in the walls at each turn of the stairs. Maybe there used to be plants there, but they died in the bad air. Maybe there were statues of saints there, but it's easy to imagine that little devils took them away to some dark and creepy place. "This is the room," said the woman, with her soft voice. "It's a nice room. It's not empty very often. Last summer, some very nice people stayed here. They were no trouble at all and paid their rent in advance. The bathroom is at the end of the hall. Sprouse and Mooney lived here for 3 months. They did a funny performance on stage. Miss Bretta Sprouse, maybe you heard of her?" "Oh, those were just the names they used on stage. Over the dresser is where their marriage certificate hung, framed. The gas is here, and there's plenty of space for your clothes. Everyone likes this room. It's always occupied." "Are there many actors and actresses living here?" asked the young man. "They come and go. Many of my tenants work in the theaters." "Yes, sir, this is where a lot of actors live. People in showbiz don't stay in one place for long. I get my fair share of them." "Yes, they come and they go." He rented the room, paying for a week ahead of time. He said he was tired and wanted to move in right away. He counted out the money. She said the room was all set up, even with towels and water. As the woman walked away, he asked the same question he had been asking so many times. "A young girl, Miss Vashner, Miss Eloise Vashner, do you remember anyone by that name living here? She might have been a singer on stage. A fair girl, not too tall, slim, with reddish gold hair and a dark spot near her left eyebrow." "No, I can't remember that name. People in showbiz change their names as often as they change rooms. They come and go." "No, that name doesn't ring a bell." "No." always no. He had spent 5 months asking the same question and getting the same answer. He had spent his days asking managers, agents, schools, and theater groups. At night, he went to different theaters, from big ones to small ones he didn't even want to visit. The person who loved her most was trying to find her. He was sure that she was somewhere in this big city, but it was like a never-ending maze, always changing, with no stable ground. Today's clues would disappear in tomorrow's confusion. The room he rented had a faint sense of comfort, though it was old and worn. It welcomed him with a half-hearted smile, like the fake smile of someone who pretends to be happy. The small comfort came from the old furniture, the torn fabric on the couch and 2 chairs, a narrow mirror between 2 windows, a couple of fancy picture frames, and a metal bed in the corner. The guest sat quietly in a chair, while the room, like a place where everyone spoke a different language, tried to tell him about its many visitors. There was a colorful rug like a bright, flowery island in the middle of a dirty, rough floor. On the walls, there were paintings that you often see in different homes, like the Huguenot lovers, the first quarrel, the wedding breakfast, and Psyche at the fountain. The fireplace was hidden behind some messy curtains that looked like they belonged to a wild dance group. On it, there were random things left behind by the people who stayed in the room before, like a couple of vases, pictures of actresses, a medicine bottle, and some playing cards. One by one, as if solving a secret code, the little marks left by the room's previous guests started to make sense. The worn-out spot in front of the dresser showed that a lovely woman had walked there. Tiny fingerprints on the wall told of small children trying to find their way to fresh air and sunlight. A stain on the wall showed where a glass or bottle had broken and splattered its contents. Someone had even used a diamond to write Marie on the mirror in wobbly letters. It seemed that the people who had stayed in the furnished room had gotten angry at its flashy but cold atmosphere and had taken out their frustrations on it. The furniture was chipped and damaged, the couch looked like a monster that had been defeated in a strange fight, and a big piece had been broken off the fireplace. Every part of the floor had its own creak and groan, as if they were each in pain. It was hard to believe that all this damage had been done by the people who had lived here for a while. Maybe it was because they felt cheated by the room, which promised so much but delivered so little. People take care of their own homes. The young man in the chair thought about all this quietly while he heard various sounds and smells coming from different rooms. He heard laughter in one room, arguing in another, the sound of dice being thrown, a lullaby, and someone crying softly. Above him, a banjo was playing with enthusiasm. Doors were slamming somewhere, and the noisy trains passed by now and then. A cat outside was crying sadly. The air in the room smelled damp and musty, like it came from underground, mixed with the strong odor of old linoleum and decaying wood. Then, suddenly, the room was filled with the sweet smell of mignonette flowers. It came with a strong, pleasant breeze that almost felt like a living visitor. The man said, "What, dear," as if someone had called him, and he jumped up and turned around. The lovely smell surrounded him like a warm hug. He reached out his arms for it, and his senses were all mixed up. How could a smell call someone? Maybe it was a sound that he mistook for a smell. But wasn't it the sound that had touched him and comforted him? She has been in this room, he said, and he jumped up to find something that belonged to her or that she had touched. The sweet smell of mignonette, her favorite scent, was in the room. Where did it come from? The room wasn't very neat. There were some hairpins on the dresser, but they all looked the same, so he ignored them. He checked the dresser drawers and found a small, old handkerchief. It smelled strongly of a flower called heliotrope, but he threw it on the floor. In another drawer, he found some random things like buttons, a program from a theater, a card from a pawnbroker, 2 lost marshmallows, and a book about dreams. In the last drawer, there was a black satin hair bow, but even this didn't tell him much about the person who had been there. He searched the room thoroughly, looking at the walls, the corners of the floor covering, the mantel, the tables, the curtains, and even a cabinet in the corner, hoping to find a clue. He couldn't see or hear her, but he felt like she was all around him, calling him with a strong feeling that even his basic senses could feel. He shouted, "Yes, dear," and turned around, but there was nothing to see. He couldn't see her in the smell of mignonette either. He was lost. He looked in every corner and hidden place and found corks and cigarettes, which he didn't care about. But then he found a half-smoked cigar in the floor covering and crushed it angrily. He searched the room from top to bottom, finding signs of many previous tenants, but he couldn't find any trace of the person he was looking for. Then he thought about the housekeeper and ran downstairs to ask her. He knocked on her door, and she came out. He tried to hide his excitement. "Could you please tell me, ma'am, who stayed in the room before I did?" "Yes, sir. I already told you. It was Sprowls and Mooney. Miss Breda Sprowls was an actress, but she was Mrs. Mooney. My house is known for being respectable. Their marriage certificate was hung on a nail over." "What did Miss Sprowls look like, physically?" "Well, sir, she had black hair, was short and a bit chubby, and had a funny face. They left last week on Tuesday." "And before them?" "Well, there was a single man who worked with draying. He left without paying me for a week. Before him, there was Mrs. Crowder and her 2 kids, who stayed for 4 months. And before them, there was old Mr. Doyle, whose sons paid for his room. He stayed for 6 months. That goes back a year, sir, and I can't remember any further." He thanked her and returned to his room. The room felt lifeless now. The lovely smell of mignonette was gone, replaced by the musty smell of old furniture and stored air. His hope was fading, and he sat there, staring at the yellow gaslight. Eventually, he went to the bed and tore the sheets into strips, which he used to seal all the gaps around the windows and door. When everything was tightly sealed, he turned off the light, then turned it back on and lay down on the bed, feeling grateful. It was Mrs. McCool's turn to buy some beer, so she got it and joined Mrs. Purdy in a cozy place where housekeepers often met and chatted. "I rented out my 3rd-floor back room tonight," said Mrs. Purdy, sipping her beer. A young man is staying there. He went to bed 2 hours ago. You're really good at renting rooms like that, Mrs. Purdy, said Mrs. McCool with admiration. Did you tell him about it? She whispered, trying to sound secretive. Mrs. Purdy replied, We furnish rooms for people to rent, so I didn't tell him anything. You're absolutely right, ma'am. We have to rent rooms to make a living. Some people won't rent a room if they hear someone died in it. Exactly, Mrs. McCool. We need to earn a living, Mrs. Purdy agreed. Yes, ma'am, that's true. Just a week ago, I helped you clean the third-floor back room. The young girl who died there was very pretty, Mrs. Purdy. She would have been considered beautiful if it weren't for a mole near her left eyebrow, added Mrs. Purdy. Would you like more beer, Mrs. McCool?